All right, everybody. Hi, how you doing? Today we're going to be talking about Congress and how it works in practice. Let's dive into our readings here. So, first we have Frances Lee. I assigned the first chapter of her 2016 book, Insecure Majorities. What is Frances Lee's central argument or theory that she posits? She does say it in this first chapter here. Divided government is the norm. Expand on that. Why is it the norm? Kind of. You're talking here a lot about the structural divisions in the House of Representatives and the Senate and Congress as a whole. What she's getting at more are these informal divisions caused largely by partisan breaks. Her central argument is about division, yes, in divided government, but along party lines. Her central argument is that the modern Congress operates in an era of near constant partisan competition, right? Where neither Democrats nor Republicans can really expect long-term control of both the House or the Senate. This then produces a kind of insecurity within the parties, what she calls insecure majorities in the title of the book. And this insecurity pushes both parties to heavily focus on winning the next election rather than building durable bipartisan cooperation. So, as our friend over here pointed out, this close competition drives partisan behavior, not bipartisan cooperation. Instead of working together on policies, members often then prioritize communication strategies that highlight the differences between the parties. So it's kind of a self-reinforcing cycle, where because we are divided, we then struggle for control over the institution. And as we struggle for control over the institution, that then prompts us to act in a way that produces more division. These actors, these members of Congress, stage message votes, and they invest in professional staff that is not so focused on legislative output as it is on public relations. It's not so much about policy development as it is about messaging. Importantly, Lee emphasizes that even when minority party members, might agree with some legislation that the majority puts forward, they often strategically withhold support for that legislation. By doing that, they're denying legitimacy for the majority party in charge and amplify public dissatisfaction with the party in power. This in turn then strengthens their own chances of winning the next election. So, the minority party doesn't necessarily gain utility through standing for anything themselves, but rather standing opposed to the majority. Famously, Mitch McConnell, who we keep bringing up, when he was majority leader in the Senate, that was under Barack Obama's administration. And he made an effective political strategy out of obstruction. He turned not doing anything into a viable path for the Republican Party to regain control. They didn't necessarily need to stand for anything. That's not to say that the Republican Party had no principles under the Obama administration. Rather, they didn't need to have it simply because they were able to just stand in the way of the Obama administration and say, we are not for what he is for, and kind of ride off of that unpopularity. The key takeaway here is that much of the conflict in Congress, it's not simply about ideology, it's about the struggle for majority control of the institution itself. This power struggle is what motivates behavior. It kind of augments and develops a little bit of what David Mayhew was talking about in 1974. We're going to pop on over to the Constitution corner real quick. Article 1, Section 9, can someone tell me what it says? Yep, limits on Congress. Habeas corpus, taxes, and they can't be nobles. We don't have a nobility in America. And someone, please tell me what Section 10 is about. Limits on states, how they act when it comes to treaties, monies, armies, and duties. Basically, we are the United States. We are not the union of several separate states. And I'm going to skip over this one because I accidentally covered it last class anyway. The 27th Amendment, as we all know, was about congressional pay change. So let's dive into Congress in action, not just Congress in theory. So I'm going to contrast a little bit last class to this one. Last class, I talked a lot about how Congress operates on paper, the structural barriers that motivate their behavior based on what they kind of should be doing. I hinted a little bit about how they actually act when we talked about committees. This class is going to dive into that much more. I'm going to make an argument that strongly leans on the fact that Congress and the behavior of members of Congress and their policy output is shaped predominantly by partisan factors. The parties govern Congress. I also kind of, along with this argument about parties, argue that the endogenous rules of the institution really matter. Now, when I say endogenous rules, I'm talking about the rules of the game that aren't necessarily stipulated by the Constitution, but that members of Congress make up themselves. The whole rule book of the House of Representatives and the Senate, the reason why we have a parliamentarian for each house to interpret those rules, is long and complicated, and none of which is specifically spelled out in the very brief Constitution, but all of it becomes somewhat necessary. The House has a lot more rules than the Senate does, simply because there are a lot more people and it could be a lot rowdier. The Senate in practice ends up being rowdier because there are less people and fewer rules. The key here is that these parties structure outcomes, but members act strategically through these rules, right? So the parties are structuring the rules and the outcomes, but individual members are operating kind of through the lines here. And as always, elections loom in the background here. That is how members of Congress seek utility. Lawmaking isn't just about policy, but about taking political advantage. And of course, this lecture is going to dive into those dynamics. So here is an image, the seal of the House Rule Committee. For something to hit the floor in the House, a rule must be attached to it. It's a very abstract concept, but a very old one for the House. We're going to pop the hood a little bit and look inside political science here to see how we measure congressional behavior. It's kind of a baseline so you understand how we understand these things that I'm going to talk about. We predominantly and historically have looked at congressional behavior through roll call votes. What's a roll call vote? Well, the presiding member of one of the houses of Congress, the president pro tempore we talked about in the Senate, stands before the Congress, and say someone asks to hear the yeas and nays on a specific vote. They will call each member of Congress's name, and they will then vote on record, yes or no, in favor or opposition to a particular issue at hand or a bill. Those then are recorded and made public, and so we can get an understanding of the kinds of things that an individual member of Congress might support based on this behavior that they partake in, these roll call votes. I should note that there is criticism, and I am a particular proponent for this view, of using roll call votes as a predictor for political behavior in Congress. It's relatively imperfect. People will take strategic votes. For instance, in the Senate, there are circumstances where a member of Congress needs to be on the winning side of a vote in order to bring up an issue again in the same session. Therefore, you'll often have members of Congress take votes or flip their votes in a way that seems opposed to their own personal preferences, simply for procedural reasons, so they can then act on that again in the future. It is a strategic choice they're making. So it makes this data a little bit confusing and a little bit imperfect, but it's kind of the best we have to draw these ideology maps. Ideology, again, is an imperfect word here, because these roll call votes are more measuring ideas about specific issues than they are about ideology itself. When we think about ideology, ideology is communism, it is socialism, it is liberalism, it is these theoretical foundations that govern our thought and our goal towards policy. Ideology in America is a little bit different, and ideology in this context is a little bit different. We get these votes on specific bills, and from that we can construct ideas about what each party stands for. For instance, we know that the Republican Party is generally the pro-life party, and the Democratic Party is generally the pro-choice party. We know that the Republican Party is generally the pro-gun party, and the Democratic Party is generally the pro-gun control party. These aren't ideologies, but they are kind of ideological positions that form these parties. The most common ideological map, or at least the most famous that we use when we talk about Congress, is DW Nominate, created by these two scholars, Poole and Rosenthal, in the 1980s. And this here, this image, is showing one of those ideology maps, a two-dimensional visualization of members of Congress's position. Going to get in the weeds here for a second. Let's start with the axes. DW nominate has two dimensions. They derive each of these dimensions from aggregating the roll call vote data for each individual member of Congress. The x-axis here shows the first dimension, what they call the economic redistributive dimension. Let's put this really simply. This is what you think about when you think of the common left-right divide. Ignore the economic label here. People to the right are conservative, people to the left are liberal. That makes sense, right? The second dimension is supposed to capture intra-party variance, as in issues that historically have split internal divisions in the major parties. Let's look at this historically. Slavery, for instance, you had pro-slavery Democrats and anti-slavery Democrats, and pro-slavery Republicans, though there were very few of them, and anti-slavery Republicans. The same thing with civil rights. And this second dimension is supposed to capture any of that variation that you might see. In practice anymore, in the literature, we just use the first dimension as a control because we are so divided as a country. It just works as a proxy that's a lot cleaner. So, this first dimension, we see left liberal, right conservative. On this map, and this is of the US Senate, each dot represents a senator. You see over here on the far right, this is Ted Cruz. You see over here on the far left, this is Elizabeth Warren. Then you can see clusters based on party here. All the blue dots are Democrats, all the red dots are Republicans. And you'll notice something, never the twain shall meet. DW Nominate helps us illuminate polarization trends. Polarization is a thing that gets talked a lot about in the media as a bad thing. I'm not going to argue that it's a good thing, but I think it is a commonly misunderstood concept. There are two concepts that go into our common conception of polarization. First, you have polarization, which is when the parties distance themselves from each other. So that means that ideologically, the Republican Party is getting further away from the Democratic Party. There's also this notion of partisan sorting. That is when voters, or members of Congress, or elected officials self-sort more and more frequently into a specific party. So I am identifying more and more frequently with the Democratic Party, and I am identifying more and more frequently with the Republican Party, rather than the opposite. Often this is truncated into the idea of partisan polarization, and that's fine to use that term. It's fine to just say polarization, but it's important to note that there are two distinct phenomena happening here. Let's look at what this kind of looks like in two-dimensional space in practice. On the bottom, we have the 96th Congress. This is the House of Representatives. And you see that there is some overlap between these blue dots and these red dots. So we move up to the 106th Congress, there is much less overlap, until you reach the 116th Congress, which is 2019 to 2022, and there is virtually no overlap whatsoever between the parties. This is both partisan sorting and polarization in action among our elected members. Part of this is also perhaps an issue with DW Nominate. Because DW Nominate is using roll call votes, and because there are these procedural strategic votes that the parties will take in order to be able to have control over the agenda, what comes to the floor, this is more or less also measuring, and perhaps predominantly measuring, party loyalty. So it might just be not that the parties are becoming more ideologically different from each other, but rather more loyal to each other. You might argue that that's a semantic difference because, in effect, the outcome is the same. We have gridlock and divided government and nasty politics. But the process is slightly different. One is a lot worse, I would argue, the ideological polarization, because that means that deep down inside we're becoming different people from each other, and that's a lot harder to overcome than the idea that the parties are just structurally becoming more loyal to each other. I'm not here to tell you which is actually happening, but this is something to keep in mind when you look at this data. As I've hinted at, parties structure the choices that individual members can make. They're the ones who establish the menu that members of Congress can actually choose from. It's not this open sandbox where they can, play around and create whatever legislation they want. The parties really put guide rails in there. This is funneled through party leaders. The leaders control the agenda. And leaders are strongest these are party leaders, when the parties are ideologically cohesive. If your party has a lot of dissenters in it, it makes the party look messy, it makes them look disorganized. The common headline that's so famous that it happens all the time every time Democrats are in power and they can't get something done is "Democrats in disarray." That's not a headline that helps your party. We're going to dive into the theory of conditional party government a little bit here. That is essentially that parties are more effective when they are ideologically cohesive. If they can present a unified front, unified message, they can get more done toward their end goals. And there are differences in how they utilize rules in the House and the Senate. The House majority has historically utilized really strict rules. I talked about this guy last class. His name is Dennis Hastert. He's a gentleman who is of the Republican Party and becomes Speaker of the House in the early 2000s. And he creates this rule, the Hastert Rule. And he argues that he decides that no piece of legislation is going to come to the floor of the House of Representatives unless a majority of Republicans support it, even if it would pass through a bipartisan coalition. No piece of legislation is going to come unless the Republicans are all on the winning side of it. I want you guys to note, too, that party cohesion drives legislative strategy, not just individual preferences. You don't just have someone voting a certain way because they're a Republican. You have someone voting a certain way because the Republican Party has a vision for where the country will go in the future. They're always looking down the road. These here are the images for the Senate Democratic Caucus and the logo for the House Republican Caucus. We're going to talk about procedural cartel theory. Cox and McCubbins have this beautiful theory, and it's that the major party acts like a cartel in like the mafia sense. They control the agenda to block bills that would split the party, even if such bills might pass otherwise. They block losing bills then that would make the party look bad, because it's all about supporting the image of the cartel itself. This all highlights something called negative agenda control, which is keeping divisive issues off the floor in order to pass important bills later on. If you guys seem divided, you're not going to be as effective later on. And this theory helps explain why some bills that are brought forward that seem beneficial to the public never end up seeing daylight, even though they might have majority support in Congress otherwise. The party is stepping in and preventing it from passing. And I don't want to say the Republicans are the only ones guilty of this. Democrats do this stuff too. So we have my friend Tony Soprano here, who is illustrating this very well, I think, in his speech bubble here. We talked a lot about committees last class. Committees, their structure also informs their behavior in a way that I think a lot of the rest of Congress doesn't. So we already talked a little bit about how they act. We noted that the committee structure enables members to specialize in specific areas of policies, filter legislation, and these committees can often determine the fate of a bill. They can filter the agenda through them too. If a bill goes into committee and changes completely or isn't allowed to see the light of day out of committee, that changes what the whole of Congress is going to end up talking about, because they're not facing the issues that originally filtered into committee. We explained ad nauseum how important median voters are. We didn't talk about something last class that I think is important to note, that leadership can bypass committees with tools like discharge petitions or special rules. By that I mean a leadership of the party. Committee chairs aren't kings. They have a lot of power. They have a lot of ability to dictate what policy ends up actually passing, what policy hits the floor. But if there is something that is abundantly popular, and I'm talking about in hypotheticals here, if there is something that is abundantly popular that goes into a committee, and there is some rogue committee chair who doesn't want it to come out of his committee, there are mechanisms in place for it to come out of committee. Committee chairs are still subservient to their party leadership in a lot of circumstances. Less so in the Senate than the House, but it's still an important note. Let's focus on the Senate here. Rules like the filibuster make the Senate a little bit more unique than the House. The House often overhauls their rules every 2 years with a new Congress. The Senate inherits rules from the past. And part of the filibuster that makes it interesting is the cloture rule. You need 60 votes to stop someone from filibustering. Does everybody here know what a filibuster is? Yeah? Speak until you are no longer able to. Cloture is incredibly hard to get, so the threat of a filibuster is often more impactful than the filibuster itself. Reforms like the nuclear option, which was used to end the filibuster for judicial nominations, for example, illustrate this notion of path dependence when it comes to legislation. Once rules change, future politics adjust in turn. You hear a lot when it comes to the filibuster, particularly from institutionalists and senators, that it's meddling with this historic institution of Congress, that Congress exists under this historic rule book that helps keep their politics civil, and the filibuster is one of those things. The thing about norms is when they're removed, new norms take their place. If we got rid of the filibuster, something else would come in that would be just as lauded by institutionalists in order to, keep the gloss of Congress. Rules aren't neutral, though. People weaponize the filibuster. People weaponize any of these rules, the Hastert rule, etc. They're political tools that shape outcomes. Here is where the importance comes in between this division between exogenous and endogenous rules. Endogenous are internal to the institution. If they're made up by the people who are playing the game can be whatever they want it to be. Exogenous rules are much harder to change. Those are in the Constitution, but they're also a lot vaguer. So, these endogenous rules are the ones you want to pay attention to. This here is an image of Jimmy Stewart in the film Mr. Smith Goes to Washington during his final climactic, triumphant filibuster at the end of the film. Veto politics are messy. We're going to turn to interbranch bargaining here. Vetoes are bargaining tools, not just rejections. So if Congress passes a law the president doesn't like, he can veto it. More than that, though, he can threaten to veto it. Just like with the filibuster, a threat can be more impactful than the actual veto. Vetoes lead to sequential bargaining. These veto threats that the president issue, they try to shape a bill before its final passage, saying, if this provision is in this bill, I will veto it. Hence, you should remove it so you can actually pass it. There's also this notion of blame game vetoes. Sometimes Congress deliberately provokes vetoes to make the president look extreme or unpopular. And of course, divided government makes this more complicated. When you have the president of one party and Congress of another party, vetoes might increase, and therefore veto threats, sequential bargaining, and all of this becomes a lot more complicated and common. Gridlock is often built into US politics. We have multiple veto players, the president, different chambers of Congress, and committees, and it makes lawmaking really slow. Divided government, as with veto politics, makes this a lot more complicated. There are a lot of institutional veto points, and more than that, there are electoral incentives for gridlock. You could argue that gridlock is a good thing. Think back to when we talked about the Constitutional Convention and the creation of the United States under the US Constitution. There's this massive fear that the legislature is going to become tyrannical. And so they spend all this time implementing all of these checks and balances. They try to really implement the separation of powers in a robust way, and that really slows down legislating. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's better that they get the idea, or they get the policy right, than get it, kind of wrong, but through faster. That's an argument in favor of gridlock. On the other side, you have this idea that gridlock just exists as a tool for potential electoral success. Members may prefer inaction if it helps their potential electoral victory in the future. I already talked about Mitch McConnell, but I want to flip back to David Mayhew. You guys didn't read this, but in his book, The Electoral Connection, there is one of my favorite mad political scientists needs to touch grass arguments I've ever heard in my career. He basically says that when the president is in charge and the economy is bad, the president gets blamed for that bad economy. The president, even though he has very little control over the economy itself, seems to take the blame for the economy a lot of the time. People don't really pay attention to Congress's impact on the economy. So say you have divided government. The president is of one party and Congress is of another party. And let's be honest, the party in charge of Congress probably wants to win the presidency over. Not only would it help them with their legislative agenda, but having one of their guys in the sexiest, most visible position in American politics would be good. So what do? You tank the economy purposefully, because the president will get blamed for it. It's really good politics. But good politics doesn't always make good policy. There's also this idea that we don't really hear about gridlock so much anymore. I don't know about you guys, but I remember growing up, you hear a lot about inaction in Congress. Congress doesn't get anything done. It's a bad idea that, they can't just get together and pass bills. This is partially this idea that people don't talk about it so much anymore because we've become desensitized to it. This is the norm. We've come to accept that most legislation and policy happens through these few omnibus spending bills that pass every year, these few Christmas tree bills. And, things keep on going, so it must be fine. And we kind of don't realize that it's very unusual to have a threat of a government shutdown every single legislative session. And it's kind of unusual to have the legislature be so unproductive in producing legislation. This figure here shows a different distribution of DW nominate scores from 1963 to 2013, also showing how polarization and partisan sorting has impacted the potential for gridlock here. You see the Democrats on the left here and Republicans in red on the right here. The Republicans have swung substantially to the right, or at least have consolidated. Again, this might be just a measure of party loyalty, voting together a lot more to the right than the Democrats have been, but they have swung slightly to the left over time as well, and never the twain shall meet. A key part of Congress is representation as well, and representation isn't just formal, as in you have a certain amount of allotted seats in Congress and you're being represented by your member of Congress. Talked a little bit about descriptive representation before. Descriptive representation is essentially this notion that Congress and elected office should look like America. If we put on our idealist glasses, and nobody actually wants this, I want to be very clear about this. This is not an actual policy goal of any party or any think group here, but a perfectly descriptively representative Congress would have about 50% of the members of Congress would be women and 50% would be men. About 10% would be African American, about 1% would be East Asian, and about 10% of them would be gay. That would be perfectly descriptively representative of the United States. It obviously is not. Substantive representation is the other side of the coin here, and the one that really matters. Substantive representation means advocating for constituents' interests regardless of your personal identity. Let's use an example here. There's a representative who is going to Congress. They are a first-generation immigrant from Latin America. They've been nominated, or they have been elected in a district that has a lot, let's say a majority of first-generation immigrants from Latin America in a border district on the southern border. That is descriptive representation. That candidate, or that elected official then, supporting comprehensive immigration reform to help the constituents in their district who are first-generation immigrants and their families, that is substantive representation. The two don't always go together. There are, of course, race and gender gaps in representation. We're not perfectly descriptively representative. There's also this notion that donor influence and money in politics can change the representation calculus. If your district overwhelmingly likes something, and a donor wants something slightly less, remember, elections are really expensive. So representatives might lean more toward doing what the donor wants simply because they will give them the money they need to win the election, and they can rhetorically gloss over potentially betraying the interests of their constituents elsewhere. And of course, we talked about the debate over unequal Senate representation. This also makes it harder for Congress, the members of Congress in the Senate, to actually know how to represent their constituents as well. The two senators representing all of New York are going to have a lot harder time understanding consensus in their state than the two senators, I constantly rag on Montana, but the two senators representing Montana would, simply because there are a lot more constituents in New York that they have to speak to than the constituents in Montana. We've also talked a lot about the nomination and confirmation process, but we haven't really talked about it as a political tool. So obviously, the Senate plays a key role through their advice and consent power. The Senate can strategically delay or stymie nomination processes in order to, one, make the nominating president look bad, or two, to actively prevent the, as they see odious, nominee from assuming the office to which they've been nominated to. This happened famously with Robert Bork, who was nominated to the Supreme Court and was actually denied his appointment. Hence why whenever people talk about a nominee potentially not actually making it to the Supreme Court, they call it being borked. Additionally, confirmation battles are an opportunity for parties to show their partisan bona fides and also to kind of test balloon or forefront their individual policy priorities. One of the events that got me interested in politics was early in my college career. Brett Kavanaugh was Donald Trump's nominee for the Supreme Court at the time. I don't know if any of you watched this confirmation hearing. I've used clips of it before in some of my videos. It did not go well for Brett Kavanaugh, but he still was appointed. He did a terrible job representing himself. But the thing that made me really interested in politics from this was the behavior of the senators on the Judiciary Committee. Famously, Lindsey Graham came out to bat for Brett Kavanaugh, despite the fact that Brett Kavanaugh was behaving very terribly during these confirmation hearings. And also on the other side, you had a lot of Democrats who basically tried out talking points that they'd later use in the 2020 presidential campaign trail. You had Amy Klobuchar, you had Cory Booker, trying a lot of these talking points about sexual harassment, sexual assault, as well as Republican domination of all three branches of government, utilized during this confirmation hearing that didn't really relate perfectly to asking questions about the qualifications of the nominee. Another example of this happening was Clarence Thomas's nomination hearing in the 1990s, in which it came out that he continually sexually harassed one Anita Hill, who I believe was a law clerk for him at the time. She is now a law professor at Brandeis University. Few key takeaways about Congress in action. Parties shape the outcomes in Congress more than most anything else. The rules of the game are political and influenced by those parties. They are not just structural. Who controls the agenda controls the policy output. We expect gridlock. It's built into the institution. It's not something we can necessarily avoid. And that's not to say that bipartisan cooperation is normatively good, but rather this kind of competition is built in. And finally, circling all the way back to Mayhew, elections drive behavior. Candidates for office find utility through winning elections. That's how they practice politics. And remember, politics is doing and winning. They win elections, they win power, and that's how they find utility.